Hey, before we get to our show, I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, Sunshower.io. They're a cloud-based solution company that helps ensure that you are spending the correct amount of money on your cloud-based solution and infrastructure. Gartner projects in 2019 almost $40 billion will be spent on cloud-based infrastructure and solutions. And you want to know a dirty secret? Most people are spending too much. That's where Sunshower.io comes in. They've got a central dashboard that will help you monitor all of your cloud-based solutions and ensure that you're spending the correct amount of money. If you don't have a cloud-based solution or infrastructure yet, they'll help you set it up and make sure it's done correctly and for the correct cost. Go to sunshower.io/nerd numbers. That lets them know we sent you, and they'll help you out. Thanks so much, and on to the show. Welcome back to another Boxscore Geeks show. We have one of our favorite guests ever, Chris Yeh of the Chris Yeh Podcast, on with us today. And so we are going to be talking some oldies but goodies, some topics you're familiar with. Mental Samurai, our new favorite game show. The Los Angeles Lakers, of course. What else did you expect? And then this is Chris's fault. Chris put this on the script. We might actually revisit Babylon 5 because I flippantly talked about it last week, and Chris has given me the excuse to talk it again. So, Chris, say hey, whatever you'd like to start us off with.
I was going to say, it's great to be back on the podcast. I must have been on at least 5 times now. This is like the Saturday Night Live 5-timers club. I need a smoking jacket.
Oh, easily more. And I was going to say, one of the biggest things I'd want to promote before we get going, and because we're also going to be hearkening back to it a lot on this show, is you have your own podcast now. It's easy to find. It's on all the places. Like, it's funny when I try and promote podcasts. I have Downcast. I can't say enough good things. The only thing I would like better about Downcast is if they had a good way for your mobile version and desktop version to sync up. But I paid like $2 for it. It lets me monitor all of my podcasts. Easy to add. I was able to find yours. I think you've got the standards. Has yours gotten the iTunes approval yet?
I'm pretty sure it has. I just went through Anchor. I'm too lazy to do anything else. I'm pretty sure they've got it in there.
Yeah, because basically similar to us, like, because we go through, what do we go through? Libsyn, sorry. Usually with a lot of these, you say, I've got this podcast, you give your feeds to a bunch of stuff, and then it's available through else. So you can easily find the Chris Yeh Podcast spelled just like you'd expect. And you started this about a year ago, so I felt really bad, Chris, but the good news is you did a bunch of really short ones, so it was really easy to catch up on. I didn't feel bad. I was like, I missed a year of Chris podcasting, and I managed to catch up on it in one walk. And then now you have a really good new direction because thanks to you, we found the show Mental Samurai, a new reality TV show with Rob Lowe. Here's hoping it gets picked up for a second season because I'm digging it. And you managed to be a contestant on it, and then you, as a result, on your podcast, started both doing recap shows, and then you talk to other contestants on the show. So it's a really interesting inside look to that. So for someone who wants to be a mega fan of anything, as I've mentioned before, my brain is broken. I blamed you for this, Chris. I sent you an email. I'm like, I should at least watch this so I know what's going on when I talk to Chris, inevitably, because you're going to be on in about a month. So it's April 30th, right?
April 30th, 9 p.m. on Fox. Be sure to tune in.
And they do have streaming. You can catch the next day or right after it airs, I think, pretty easily. I signed up for an Amazon. You can buy like the Amazon season pass for like $20, which I did because I take screenshots. So I want to make sure I can, fast forward and rewind. So tune in for Chris Yeh on Mental Samurai, April 30th. And then if you want to keep caught up, I've been doing kind of advanced stats, as I mentioned, at Nerd Numbers. And then Chris, you've had a great podcast where you've interviewed a bunch of people. And then, of course, now as a fan, I want to ask some behind-the-scenes stuff that I don't know you've brought up on your show. But I did want to ask you about that on the podcast. Like, between being a contestant and all this, how soon was like the light bulb of, I'm going to start podcasting this and get people on and interviewing them? Because you were ready to go really quick.
So I would say that the idea came to me basically after the first or second episode. So right after the first episode, I thought to myself, I was having a watch party and I had a bunch of people there and I was explaining some of the behind the scenes things. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, this is great content. I should be podcasting this. And especially with the Mental Samurai season proceeding as it is, and with my desire to make the show as successful as possible, I thought, why don't I do this? I happen to have the ability to reach out to pretty much all the contestants who appear on the show. And if no one else is going to do it, my goodness, I'm going to jump in.
And then what I was going to say was fantastic. If you haven't heard this yet, that'd be weird. But so Chris, you interviewed Jamie Alexander today, or at least I heard it today. It looked like it went up to 7, so I think I'm close to caught up. And what I really enjoyed is anytime there's a reality TV show, there is anybody who's familiar with reality knows this. It's the same as wrestling. We keep talking that over and over, where like if you're a wrestling fan, there are aspects of wrestling that you just accept, where it's storyline, drama, whatever. With a lot of these reality TV show, they get this quick clip, right, where they want to give us an image of a person and tell a narrative really quick. And obviously there are incentives on the editor's part. I'm not saying nefarious, but there's an incentive to say, here's the story we want to tell this person. So Jamie Alexander, when her episode aired, the image they wanted to portray is, I'm Jamie Alexander, I'm hyper confident, I'm going to kick ass, I'm going to win. And, then you and I, even when we commented on her run, said, she kind of overwent on some of the questions, spent too long on some of them. But then when you interviewed her, what I thought was great is, first off, behind the scene information that we've discovered, you've talked about, is the producers tell you, you were saying this too, but the producers also say, talk out your answers. So she said that. And then she said she was really nervous. So I was like, oh, the story we were told on air was completely different than actually what the contestant themselves said.
Yes. And so the way to think about it is, if you're the producer of the show, what you're trying to do is you're trying to create an entire season of television. And in order to do this, you might do any number of things. And the way you make sure this works is you get enough, what they call in the industry, coverage ahead of time. So when you shoot a movie and it's going to take 2 hours, you don't shoot 2 hours of film, you shoot 2,000 hours of film. And in the editing bays, they put the movie together. It's not quite so extreme for a show like Mental Samurai, but it still is the case that there is vastly more footage than they ever put on the air. So when all of us contestants were there in Los Angeles, in Burbank to be precise, there were repeated interviews they did with us. And in those interviews, they might ask us the same question 4 or 5 times, and we'd give them slightly different takes every time just to see, hey, which is going to fit better.
And then also, I know, like in the splicing, as you know, I preamble a lot when I ask questions. If you splice off my preamble and have your answer, it can sound a lot different, because I know Heather Hurley, for instance, one of her answers, I know they obviously wanted to portray her as matter-of-fact, hard-nosed genius. Because there's one point where she says, I am a genius, I'm a member of Mensa. We didn't hear how the producer asked that question, because that preamble might have been, well, do you think you're smart? Like, is there any metric you could use to say how smart you are? And she could say, well, I am a genius, I'm in Mensa. That might have been how, but we don't, as the audience member, we don't see that. We see a bunch of spliced together things. So it is really nice to meet the real people, which you have been doing on your show. So yeah, if you're a fan of Mental Samurai, Chris's podcast is a must listen.
And one of the other things that is not necessarily apparent is that the contestants themselves, us competitors, we have a secret Facebook group where we get together and we talk about the show. Obviously, we don't reveal anything about the results of the show because we've all signed legal agreements not to, but we meet with the other contestants, we ask who's going to be coming up in this future episode, and we try to connect with people. And that's how I'm able to get people on for interviews, because most of us who are on the air belong to this Facebook group where we're actually watching the show just like you are. And I'm sharing your advanced stats with that community.
One, I didn't manage to get in a bit behind the scenes on last week's advanced stats. I'm starting to get to the point where I'm collecting enough where I can start running meta-analysis of it, because I've started doing this, like which questions down people, which questions take the longest. You have access to that, Chris, so any analysis you want to do as well. But
I wish I had access to that before I went on my run.
That would have been good to know. I'll get back to one in a second, but I was going to say, so far, your friend Joey Gutman, who you had on your podcast as well, he thus far has the distinction of being I don't know how to phrase this right. I'm trying. You'll have to help me come up with a metric term, Chris. The shortest long run, as in for someone who answered at least 10 questions correctly, he spent his correct answer that took the most time was the shortest amount of time, because every contestant gets at least a little bit flummoxed on some question, right? The strategy I would give you, so to recap Mental Samurai for those that don't know, you've got 5 minutes to answer 12 questions. There are 4 different categories. You are being swung around in this gyroscope. You've kind of compared it to a roller coaster, really fast in between each. And so we broke down the numbers, and essentially it takes about 8 to 10 seconds between each question while you're being basically flung around in this roller coaster to throw you off your game. You have about 16 seconds to, or I think actually 18. You have about 18 seconds to answer your question, and it's in one of four categories: memory, sequence, puzzles, and knowledge. And there is some overlap in the type of mini game in each of those. So that's how the game goes. And so the goal you would want to have is you want to answer questions as quickly as you can, so that when you get to a question that inevitably takes you longer than it needs to, you've built up the bank. Joey actually did the best on that, although ironically, as we've said, he was on your show and I've reviewed his run. He probably went too quick on the question that got him. He even said this was a nice behind the scenes on yours. He said watching his run, he realized he had the information he needed to get the answer, but he answered before he put it together.
Yeah, and he had plenty of time too, because as you pointed out, he was on a good run, well ahead of schedule. I got to tell you that what I wish is that I were such a genius competitor that as I was backstage in the on-deck circle watching people go through their runs, that I would have timed the amount of time it took between questions and figured out the pace I needed to go at. But sadly, I was too busy watching the questions go by. It never occurred to me to do that, and I really should have done that.
I was going to ask, how much? So you said you were on the on-deck circle. I know one of your competitors, I think Clayton Anderson, the astronaut, said that he got to talk to, I believe, Donovan Hand, the baseball player. So there's a switch off. You kind of have to, as I think some of your competitors have said, you go onto an elevator up to this gyroscope, which makes sense. And you do get to talk to a competitor in between, and you've been in a room for hours and hours before this occurs. So you know each other. Clayton said that he gave some advice to Donovan right before he went on. How many questions did you see ahead of time before you got? How complete of the run? And then, of course, that seems like it would give an inherent advantage to someone who's gotten to sit on the, as you were saying, on deck circle for a while. Like, what is the most of the show you'd be able to have watched before going on a run?
Yeah, so it very much was luck of the draw. And they brought us in groups of, I think, roughly 8 or so. And I was towards the middle of my group. So Clayton, Donovan, another player, and Joey all went before me. So I actually got to watch 4 different runs, which was great. Clayton went in there and he had to go in cold. He had not seen a single thing.
Oh, wow. That gives even more to his run.
So you do have the opportunity to sort of get a sense of how the game works. None of the runs that I watched ended up being a completed 12-question run, so I didn't have that. But Joey's run was pretty long, but it was right before I went on, and so I didn't have a lot of time to process it. And if I, again, were really on top of things, maybe I would have done that.
But it seems like it's really hard to know how to meta-analyze. One piece of feedback I'll give to all the contestants, something you can tell them, because I know I'm being the classic advanced stats guy, and I know in basketball circles I have basketball players. This is very weird. Donovan Mitchell is a huge fan of mine because I come up and I criticize, and I've used that background of the basketball thing as I'm writing about people to go, I don't want to be hyper critical, even though I'm being an analyst who is going over these people's runs, and you have to note the mistakes, and it does get really hard right on some where they just make a kind of a boneheaded play, and you're like, how am I nice about that? But yeah, I will say I have the advantage of I pause as I'm going through because I have to screen capture things or I have to time things, and I still miss questions just on simple things. So I will give that to the competitors, even someone who after, like I said, about 10 minutes went, I'm going to start doing this. I've analyzed it. So as I'm watching the show, like on a few runs, I will say Jamie Alexander was on your show. I was watching her. How am I dropping his name? The karaoke guy that ran out of time.
His name was Mitch.
Mitch, thank you. Mitch on last week's show ran out of time. As I'm watching the show, I can know ahead of time. I'm like, oh, this is going to happen. Or, oh, there's no way to, if it's a hearsay question as an example, hearsay, on the show, for those that don't know, the way it works is they play you an audio clue and then they ask you a question. The key about that is you are locked. You cannot answer that question in faster than 16 seconds. It is physically impossible. Whereas if they ask you, a multiple choice question that you can read really quick, you can buzz that in immediately and I believe get that in 6 seconds. So I know the show well enough that as I'm watching it, I know what's going on. There are still questions that muck me up and flummox me up. So I give all the competitors a lot of credit. And the fact that you're even saying, man, I should have been doing this meta-analysis, I'm like, I have a computer and spreadsheets and all this, and it still took me a while. I wouldn't have done it after only watching 2 or 3 people play.
And by the way, many of these contestants, these competitors, were very seasoned competitors. Joey, as I mentioned, had been on Jeopardy and Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. There are a couple of other contestants coming up who had also been on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and a couple of other shows. If you go on YouTube and you look this up, Heather Hurley was actually a part of a winning team on a game show network show called The Chase. A team of 3 people won $180,000, and she was part of that team.
Oh, wow. And I mean, she did really well. The comparison I keep making, I always bring this back to myself in chess, because this does really compare a lot, in my opinion, to playing blitz chess. In fact, even the time controls, because one of the most popular time controls for chess is 5 minutes. And like I said, watching some of these competitors, it is really going, oh, this is just like blitz chess where this screws you up, or the like 2 popular blunders I have for myself, and this would describe both Joey and then Heather, who were 2 really strong competitors, didn't quite do it. In Joey's case, like he said himself, he had all of the information he needed. He just went too fast. And there have been times in chess where someone attacks my queen and I guard it with a knight. And I'm like, okay, I'm guarding that. I'm guarding my queen with that knight. That's where my knight's there. And then 2 moves later, I'm like, I'm going to move my knight to do this. And then they take my queen, and you go, you knew about that. That's why it was there. You knew that. If you'd spent 2 more seconds to go, wait, why is my knight there in the first place? You wouldn't have made that move, but that happens. And then, of course, the classic one is just moving too fast. And I think in Heather's case, that is exactly what happened. She had the answer. She was well ahead of schedule, and she just answered too quickly. And there's no real answer other than, oh, that's just a blunder. You hate to see it.
Yeah. And the tough part there, of course, is she had plenty of time because she had finished the 12-question course early. She had time left over, and then she was going through this 4-question course. So she could have easily taken twice as much time on that 3rd question and not even worried about it.
What's rough for Heather's, so for those that don't know, again, we're spoiling past episodes, so catch up if you don't want spoiled in the future. Heather Hurley made it. There are 2 rounds. Round of Samurai is the 2nd round. So the first round, you've got to answer 12 questions correctly. You get into a 2nd round. There are 4 questions. You get 25 grand for each question you get correct, which is awesome. You get all 4 right. You get 100 grand. The title of Mental Samurai, and she managed to get halfway through 50,000. Incredibly impressive. And what's rough about her fall is I can't fault anything. It's just, like I said, it is just a chess blunder. And here's a fun comparable I'll give, keeping it in the chess realm. Garry Kasparov, one of the greatest chess players ever, when he lost to Deep Blue back in the day, he fell for an opening trap. An opening trap any grandmaster of his skill would know. He's one of the best ever, and it just happened. And it's one of those where there aren't, in Joey's case, you can say, here's how you messed up. And in Heather's case, you just go, oh, you just said the wrong answer. You knew it. So I don't know. I wanted to give one more thing about the show, then maybe we'll wrap up our talk there and move on to Lakers. But I was going to say, on your podcast, you had a great episode unrelated to Mental Samurai about napping. You said it's one of your superpowers. This is advice you actually give tech area people, which is, on this, all-nighters kind of thing, this popular tech bro culture, your comment is being rested is important. So what you actually did earlier in your career, and I think even still now, is you got really good at taking 20-minute power naps. And so you pull all-nighters, but an all-nighter for you is go until you're too tired, take a 20-minute power nap, come back at it. You said that was how you wrote a lot of the book Blitzscaling and the advice you gave. And there was a competitor who won, Nathan Gonzalez. And it was funny how well those lined up with each other. Your napping strategy, basically go until you're tired, rest, go, recharge, go back. Because, as we mentioned on the show, there's 2 parts. Answering this question, Rob Lowe asking a question, you trying to keep everything in memory or trying to determine where a bunch of cities are on a map or whatever. And this part where you're being flung around on essentially a roller coaster. And what a lot of the competitors do is on the roller coaster, you watch their face. They're very all business. They're trying to keep themselves calm as this roller coaster is going around and keep their mind in the game. Nathan Gonzalez basically treated those runarounds as a roller coaster, as I'm going to take a quick break. I'm playing this game show. I've got a 10-second break where I'm going to decompress and we have fun, relax. And you called it on your show Fast and Fun. You called it the Fast and Fun strategy, which I thought was great. And then in my mind, I said it reminded me of the napping strategy because he was essentially taking a nap. Even in Heather's case, by the time you get to question 14, right? She fell on 14. That's a lot of pressure. That's a lot of anxiety. You've got Rob Lowe reminding you of your time, of the money. Like I said, my personal psychoanalyzing of Heather is that she knew she won. I think that was what killed her. I've seen that happen to myself in chess so many times. She knew she had it, and her brain got excited. But the key that Nathan did is he calmed himself down in between each run with, like I said, you're fast and fun. And I compared it to taking a nap. And yeah, looking at his times for, like I said, people tracking advanced stats, he is by no means the strongest runner. I got to give a shout out to your boy, Dr. Ken. Dr. Ken was perfect. I love Dr. Ken. I if you can pass this along to him or whatever, if he knows, I want this clear. He played perfect strategy. It was just he got knocked out on a gap in pop culture knowledge, and for what it's worth, that's just part of the game. This game is luck, because even Sam Durbin, who was one of the earlier strong competitors who made the second round, he didn't know who was married to Daniel Craig, but it was a toss-up. It was a 50-50, so he guessed, and he got it right. So Dr. Ken was in the same boat, gap in mental knowledge. He realized the same thing to your time management, Chris. He was like, I can't waste too much time on it, so I'm just going to take my best educated guess. He did a perfect run, but just luck can knock you out. But, just in this, Nathan Gonzalez, perfect run, and, didn't go as fast as he needed to, but just did fast and fun, so I enjoyed it.
And I'm calling it right now. If there is a second season, and apparently the executive producers are over in Cannes, France right now, selling the format. Apparently it's going to be a global thing where they have mental samurai equivalents in various other countries. That doesn't mean they'll renew it in the U.S., but it's one of the formats that is said to be really interesting to the broadcast networks overseas. It's an American original as opposed to an import like The Masked Singer. But what I would say is that Nathan's strategy will eventually be the dominant strategy. I think if there's a season 2, competitors will watch season 1 and they'll see what Nathan did and they'll say, that's the way I should play.
Because, yeah, when I was running down the advanced sets, that was the most impressive thing to me. Is I was going through, and his answer times, like, I color code them green and red. So if you go to Nerd Numbers, you can see all this. That's pretty much the only content at Nerd Numbers right now. And what I noticed is I'm like, yeah, he's got a bunch of these in the mid-10s, which is fine. That's really good. But, like I said, Dr. Ken and Heather, as an example, two of the really strong earlier competitors, they're answering things in 6 to 8 seconds, whereas Nathan keeps a very steady pace, keeps himself calm in between, and just does amazing. And as you said on your show, you could not have picked a better winner for the show.
Yeah. What was interesting, by the way, is you'll notice that despite the fact that he didn't seem like he was rushing, he had a lot of extra time left over that he carried over to the Circle of Samurai round.
Oh, yeah, he crushed on the time entirely, but that was because, it was he didn't crush things in 6 to 8 seconds, but he didn't, the only one, the alpha order one, I can actually give it to him because some of these questions, the other thing that mucks competitors up, and it's part of the show, is there'll be like a 2-parter. I want to give a shout out to Jamie Alexander again, who is on your show. Part of what mucked her up is it's very back to schoolish. Solve this part first and then use the answer from that part to solve part 2. One of the tricks you can use is you don't need to completely solve part 1 to solve part 2. And in fact, in some cases, you could get part 2 without much of part 1. And that actually happened to me. I didn't know who Neil Young was either when I was going, but I knew Albany immediately. I have, for my little kid, my 2-year-old, I have the states and the state capitals right next to my office thing. I've got a map of the United States hanging up. So I saw Alba and I went Albany, lock it in. Then I watched her struggle. That I was like, oh, this is rough. And what she even said on her show is she was trying to solve Neil Young, which is just really hard. So
and then the other crazy thing, for those of you who haven't listened to that podcast yet, is that morning, before they took our phones away, she had thought to herself, I should really look up state capitals because that might come up.
And then just a confluence of events happened so that she didn't end up doing it. And that's got to be rough. And as she even noted, Albany, New York would have been top of the list. And
she lived in New York for a couple of years.
Well, she even knew it right at the end of the show when she went back to Rob Lowe. She knew it immediately. And that was the problem I love this show for that, is that part of what screws people up, and that's any good game show, is you get hung up on one part of the question and you don't think holistically or even time management wise. I need to just move on. What I'll say is the one question that mucked up Nathan early was that because it was ordering 3 images, And he had to solve what the 3 images were first. So that was the only thing that took him time. But beyond that, he just amazing run.
Yep.
Anything else you want to say about Mental Samurai before we move on to the Lakers?
Just that people should definitely watch on April 30th. And by the way, Brian, I'm going to have a Bay Area watch party. So if you want to come and watch in person, I'll be there to answer questions after the show ends. I have to actually leave after 30 minutes because I have to get on a red-eye flight to New York City. I'm giving a keynote speech the next day, but I will be there for the party, and there will be 30 minutes afterwards for questions.
That's
I was
awesome.
going to say, so what is your digital policy? Is Brian allowed to like Twitch, live stream, anything like that?
Oh, absolutely, Brian. If you want to Twitch and live stream the party, you're welcome to.
I might have to find, because what I do is I watch the show at about 2 a.m, and in fact, Chris, this happened with me. I watch it the next day, and you have forced me to push how early I release my stats because you released the podcast about episode 1 and you interviewed 3 contestants, and I clicked on the info and it said, including last night's big winner, Sam Durbin, and I hadn't finished watching the episode. And I was like, damn it. And then, of course, now I follow a bunch of Mental Samurai competitors on Twitter. And that even happened too, where one of the people, Nathan Hayes, I believe, am I getting the name right? I don't want to mess anybody's name up. But
Kevin Hayes.
Apologies, Kevin Hayes, who is amazing. Kevin Hayes was congratulating. So it's like I've not been in this position in years, Chris, where I have to like media embargo myself, avoid Twitter, avoid friends to not get something spoiled. But that started happening, so I might have to find a way to watch it live as well that night.
Well, you can always watch the live stream, but it'll be ending at 1 a.m. Eastern for you. So,
that's fine with me. All right, so let's talk Lakers because I mean this won't be too much new information to anybody because Brian and I talk it most weeks. And of course, Chris, you're a huge fan. I just want to ask you, as one of our more even-keeled Lakers fans, you passed the Laker test we have, which is the Boxscore Geeks show. We have a habit of making fun of Lakers fans, but I find if Lakers fans answer this one very simple question correctly, we can tell if we like him or not. Is Kobe the greatest Laker of all time? If they answer that yes, I go, just wipe my hands, and I'm like, we should probably just avoid each other. It'd be best for both parties. If they say no, I go, you're probably a fantastic fan. I want to be friends with you. And that has been very true of a lot of Boxscore Geeks fans. As a Lakers fan, a good Lakers fan, and you had a dog named Kobe at one point, so you are a Kobe fan, but you still recognize he wasn't the greatest ever. How do you feel about this season?
Well, so obviously the season is a big disappointment. I think coming into the season, we even did a little preview. I think that was when I was on my book tour before I filmed Mental Samurai. And at the time, I think we generally felt like the Lakers were probably going to be a 50-win team.
This is October 8th, Chris, so it was about 2 weeks before the season started.
That's right. And I think that the sense was, hey, you know what, the Lakers have a lot of promising players. They made some smart signings, JaVale McGee, Rajon Rondo. Those are good signings. The young kids ought to improve. We had coming in guys like Josh Hart and Lonzo Ball looking really good. And so the feeling was, hey, the Lakers are probably going to win 50-plus games, be in the playoffs, and maybe have a puncher's chance in the Western Conference playoffs. And, of course, things were trending along those lines. And, of course, on Christmas Day, the Lakers beat the Warriors, a huge win. But it was also that day that LeBron James tore or strained his groin and Rajon Rondo broke his hand. And after that, the season just went to hell.
I didn't realize those happened on this. I apologize as much as we covered Lakers. I didn't realize that happened on the same day because that's the season. I mean,
and a blowout win for the Lakers too. That's bittersweet.
Yes. Same game. And then the Lakers finally managed to right themselves as Lonzo was leading them. And then Lonzo tears the ligaments in his ankles against the Rockets. They were pounding the Rockets and about to blow them out when Lonzo injured his foot. He was out. Rondo was also out. The Lakers were sunk. The Rockets came back to win that game, and the Lakers went into a tailspin.
And I mean, I think that is. I'll give you LeBron. Here's a funny one. A friend of mine a few years ago. This was, I think, right after LeBron James won his third title with the Cavaliers, beating a 73-win Warriors. A friend of mine passed along an article from Dave Barry to me because this is great. Gotta love Dave being a trendsetter. He wrote an article for Freakonomics, I believe, right as LeBron James, I think, was going to Cleveland, saying LeBron James is due to decline any season now. And, he said that right before he went to 4 straight finals, including having one of the greatest finals MVP performances ever. And that's an easy level of mockery. And I think I made a tweet about that. I was like, I was on the LeBron James is declining train before it was cool. So, I mean, you could probably have argued that LeBron James was on his way down. But something I love that you did, Chris, and this just makes it really rough, is you went over LeBron James's career, looked at his wins produced, looked at his teammates' wins produced, and looked at his second best player. So those 3 pieces of information since he went to Miami. And so this won't surprise most people. Usually LeBron James gets between 16 and 20 wins. Usually his supporting cats gets 30 to 40 wins. In the really good seasons, it was closer to 40. That's when Chris Bosh, Dwayne Wade, Mike Miller are all healthy. And then usually his second best player is, I think it's Dwayne Wade, Kevin Love, and then last year was just depressing because Kevin Love's the second best player, but Kevin Love, very similar to Rajon Rondo and Lonzo Ball, out injured half the season. So LeBron James actually had some of the best support he's had in a couple of years this season, 31 wins out of the Lakers that weren't him. But his second best player is JaVale McGee, and a large part of that is because Rajon Rondo's injured, Lonzo Ball is injured. They didn't pick up any of Jimmy Butler, Kawhi, Paul George,
Anthony Davis
like they wanted. So it's one of these where if LeBron James isn't injured, this team is easily as good as last year's Cleveland Cavaliers team that went really far. I mean, I think what's funny is those 3 injuries and then one player, I know I want to let you get your licks in on him, Chris, is Kyle Kuzma. Kyle Kuzma just had a really underwhelming sophomore season.
Yeah, and I think that's the bottom line. If you look at the Lakers this year, the non-LeBron Lakers, this is as a couple of games ago, that's improved since then, since they've won a couple of times. They've actually been winning now that they can't make the playoffs anymore, thanks to amazing play by JaVale McGee, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, and Alex Caruso. Amazingly enough.
Caruso had a dunk, a putback dunk. Did you see that, Chris, a few games ago?
Yeah, absolutely. Caruso is fascinating. He's an above-average player. He's there in the G League. He looks like he should be selling insurance, and yet he is out there. And in last night's game, which was a win against the Jazz, who were fighting for playoff position, he actually went down the lane and tried to throw down a dunk over Rudy Gobert. He was fouled and missed the dunk, but just for Alex Caruso to go up against Rudy Gobert and just take him head-to-head is pretty impressive.
Wow, he is. Is an interesting one.
He could be a great backup point guard for the Lakers in the future. But if you look at the Lakers this year, the non-LeBron Lakers produced about 32, 33 wins. And if you look at the previous season, the Lakers actually had some bad luck last year. They produced almost 40 wins, but they only ended up with 35 because they had a lot of clustering bad luck. And if you remove Julius Randle, because he's no longer on that team, and sort of LeBron essentially substitutes for Julius Randle in this case, and Brook Lopez, who ironically enough actually produced a little bit of wins, I think it was right around 0, you still had a 34-win team that sort of came into this year. So despite all the problems the Lakers had, despite all the injuries the Lakers had absent LeBron, the team was actually not bad. It was pretty close to last year's team, and it was better than 2 of LeBron's finals teams, the 2012 Miami team and the 2018 Cavs team.
And so, I mean, it is funny. There is only so many injuries any team can take. And we know this about basketball. It's one of the funniest points. I'm going to briefly use this to talk about my Nuggets and then use my pizza metaphor that we were talking pre-show. So everybody is kind of just making it a foregone conclusion that the Nuggets are going to lose to the Rockets in the playoffs. I'm a little upset, maybe, Brian, because last night against
Arturo's going hard on this, by the way. He is convinced.
We've had some nice back and forth on that, but I'll explain my take. Last night, they rested some of their stars against the Portland Trail Blazers, in theory to be healthy and rested for the playoffs. They had a really close game, though, and this is resting their MVP, Nikola Jokic. So had they played Jokic, maybe they beat the Portland Trail Blazers and maybe they keep that number 2 seed. It's still possible for them to keep the number 2 seed, but with how Houston's playing, everybody's making it a foregone conclusion that A, Houston's going to get the number 2 seed out west. B, the Nuggets and Houston are going to play each other in the second round. And C, Denver is going to get beaten by Houston, which, by the way, not a hard take to have, given that if you look at their regular season, I think Houston is 3-1 or 5-1, whatever the number of games they played each other against the Nuggets. James Harden looks hot, etc. But something that I really get upset with people about in terms of analyzing playoff basketball is basketball may be the most consistent sport of the big four in the United States, but it is so Pareto driven, meaning that your top couple of players dictate your success, that a tweak or injury to a top player completely changes things. And as you're noting, Chris, that's the Lakers. Lonzo, Rondo, LeBron, arguably those are your top three players. All three got injured. That's enough to derail you. In the playoffs, an injury to James Harden completely changes the dynamic between the Denver Nuggets and the Houston Rockets. Last season, Chris Paul got injured, and that's the reason we're not talking about the defending championship Rockets. So it does amuse me so much when people try and use certainty in sports, which is now what's happening. There's a lot of post hoc rationalization about the Lakers while ignoring something we all know, which is an injury to a key player is the difference between a title team and arguing if this team belongs in the finals.
Absolutely. And people always overlook the fact that if you go through the history of every playoffs, there are always key injuries that occur, and those injuries dramatically affect what happens. We look back and we see who won, and we think, oh, it was inevitable that the Bulls would have won, or it's inevitable that the Lakers would have won. And yet it's often far from inevitable.
Yeah, I mean, I know what I love about you as a Lakers fan, Chris, is you are the you are the ultimate Lakers fan in the sense that you're not happy. That is a requirement to be a good Lakers fan. Anything less than 16-0 and a 60-win season means there's room for improvement.
Absolutely. We still need to catch those Celtics. We have 16 championships. They have 17. We have been waiting forever to catch up and succeed them.
Greg, can I say one thing on the injuries that I was just looking at here? So here's how bad these injuries are, to me anyway. So you look at another team. The team I'm most familiar with, the Warriors, they had injuries as well this year. And they're also known as a team that likes to rest players a lot, right? They win a lot of games. They rest players in the fourth quarter. So how many minutes did their top players play this year? They had 4 guys get over 2,000 minutes. Now, I know that's just an arbitrary number of 2,000, but this is a good example here. Durant and Thompson, they were both in the 2,600 range. Durant almost at 2,700 range. Steph Curry, 2,300. He missed time with injury. Draymond Green, 2,000. So those are the top 4 minutes getters for the Warriors. Now let's compare to the Lakers. Only Kyle Kuzma played more than 2,000 minutes, and he played 2,300 minutes. Their worst player, right? No one else got there. LeBron, KCP, they did not get to 2,000 minutes. So yeah, they missed a lot of games on their key players.
Well, it's funny. I don't quite know what to call this. We like naming a lot of things, but I would put Kuzma in this weird boat, which is, it reminds me of Linsanity, except Jeremy Lin, despite not being the next Michael Jordan. So Linsanity was this period where Jeremy Lin, I think his first 7 to 10 NBA games, put up Michael Jordan numbers. And he did this in Madison Square Garden, biggest stage of them all. So that's huge. It's in fact how we became friends, Chris, because you wrote a great article about the stupid bias. I think you and Hari Kondabolu nailed it perfectly, where people were like, oh my God, Jeremy Lin is just this deceptively good player. And you can just press and go, deceptive how? Say what you and Hari Kondabolu, his joke is he's a point guard in the NBA. When people say he's deceptively quick, he's like, the literal job description of point guard in the NBA for everybody but Ray Felton is super fast, person. So it's so that's how we became friends. But Jeremy Lin had this amazing start, and then he basically turned into a serviceable starting NBA point guard, which is more than fine. I mean, he's had some injuries derail him, but he is a good player, not great. But there was this high expectation initially. Kyle Kuzma was in the same boat. Starts off amazingly hot. And I think we've talked a ton about how teams sometimes put too much pressure on high draft picks, right? This is my point about Carmelo Anthony. I think Carmelo Anthony was ruined by the Nuggets. I think Carmelo Anthony, if he had been signed by the Detroit Pistons, which is a very real possibility, he would have been ramped up slowly a la Kawhi Leonard. He would have learned the right way to play basketball. He would have been more team and defense oriented, and he would have been less focused on forcing the shot as much as he did. And he could have potentially been a dynasty great and could have possibly kept those Detroit Pistons great an extra couple seasons. But he went to the Nuggets where he was expected to shoulder the whole load. Kyle Kuzma had this great start, and so the Lakers oh, you're a starter. And unfortunately, I think for Kyle Kuzma, he kind of regressed hugely in his sophomore season. And as we're noting, really is a huge part of why that team underwhelmed. He was terrible this season. And I think a lot of that is this team going, you're a young player, we're going to put the weight of the world on your shoulders. And I have not seen too many cases where that works out well, except for a couple of greats, LeBron James is an example.
Right. And I think one of the interesting things about Kyle Kuzma is I think that the reason he looks so bad is because if we measure him as a big, he looks terrible because his rebounding is subpar and he doesn't score. He doesn't do the things that a big man does. If you look at him as a wing, he's still not great, but the comparison is much more flattering for him. And one of the points that the Lakers podcasters make is they think that some of them have said, Kuzma is actually much better at chasing wings around on the perimeter, and they often use him on perimeter players. And he doesn't really play a traditional big man role. When the Lakers play the Warriors, and Brian, you can back me up on this, a lot of the times Kuzma is guarding Klay Thompson.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, we said this on the last show, too. Like, this is such a common problem. And I've got his numbers up here right now. And yeah, I mean, he's good at things that wings do and not good at things that big men do. So I think you should play him at wing. And Dre, I always forget which old score Wages of Wins person this is, but you always remind me, who says that you want to get somebody, guarding the smallest player they can guard, not the biggest player they can guard. That's what's going to benefit your defense.
It's Devin Dignam has a min-max strategy, which is you want to play the biggest player you can at the smallest position you can. So, I mean, obviously, in some cases, you can't play Rudy Gobert as a shooting guard or a point guard. He does not have, the ball handling skills or whatever for that. But, as an example, it's why Giannis and Ben Simmons are such cheat codes, because you have a power forward that's able to play a guard position, which means, to something you love, Brian, play traditional bigs. Now I can play Amir Johnson and Joel Embiid at the bigs and have competent, really good bigs. And I've cheated because I basically have a big at the point guard. You're familiar with this, of course, Chris, with
Magic
Matt
Johnson.
Exactly. So it is so it's like Kyle Kuzma, if you think he's power forward-ish, which his numbers say he has no business being a power forward, his numbers say he would be kind of Dwayne Wade this season level-ish as a shooting guard if you played him that. It's like if you think Kyle Kuzma is power forward-ish, play him as a shooting guard, and now you have an edge at the shooting guard position, whereas if you play him as a power forward, you have a liability at the power forward.
Yeah. And, again, part of what Kyle Kuzma does is he has a very aesthetically pleasing game, and so people overrate him. Exactly. He has so many beautiful moves. He looks great out there, but as the saying goes, the numbers don't lie. It doesn't matter how good someone looks. If they don't actually deliver, then they're not productive.
I know we talked about this on the show, Chris. I at least wanted to hear you chime in to see if you agreed, especially since I think it does fall kind of in the blitzscaling category, and we're going to talk to you a little bit about that to end the show. But the Anthony Davis quote-unquote debacle, I didn't view it as much of a debacle. In fact, I was very pleased with it because my kind of general thinking was the Lakers did the best they could to get Anthony Davis. And for all the talk of people saying, here's how they mucked it up, I'm going to date this podcast. So there's a nice viral thing going around, which is somebody wrote an article that says, if you don't send me a thank you letter for a job interview, I don't give you a second glance. And of course, people are noting this is intentionally clickbaity. This is intentionally baiting. It's going for the headlines. I'll give it that. But the point being, a lot of interviewing is arbitrary. When people say the key to getting hired is this, sometimes the answer is the key to getting hired is just, you apply on the right day and the person's feeling in a good mood. I applied at HP way back in the day for an internship. My credentials were probably a little below what they needed to be. What was funny is HP was about to go into a hiring freeze. So if they wanted to get an intern for the summer, they needed to hire in the next day or two. And I was the best looking candidate they had seen so far. So they said, they offered me the job offer as fast as they could because they knew if they waited, they were going to get a freeze. That benefited me because odds are if they didn't have the freeze, they would have probably gone another week or two, found a much stronger candidate than me. I'll admit, like I said, my credentials at the time were not as strong as some of my friends I knew who were also going for HP. Sometimes it's just right place, right time. So when people are saying they mucked this up with the Pelicans, that's not necessarily true because it's possible the Pelicans were 1 or 2 days away from folding, and in fact, this is going to go back down poorly for Pelicans history. Because I guarantee you this is going to turn very much back in the day Chris Paul, where they waited too long to trade Chris Paul, and by the time they traded him, no one was happy. Barring being stupid with what they were doing with Pau Gasol, if the Pelicans had traded Chris Paul for Pau Gasol, that's an unfortunate rhyme, back in the day with the Lakers, that would have actually worked out decently for them. In fact, when I was analyzing that trade, I kind of said the Lakers are actually giving up more assets on paper than they're getting back, but Chris Paul is a star, so you go for the star. The Pelicans are going to do the same thing with Anthony Davis. I'm calling it now. They're going to give him up for way less than they should by trying to play chicken. And people are going to view this period of time where the Lakers offered them everything, especially if, for instance, Lonzo Ball. If Lonzo Ball comes back healthy next season, and it turns out they could have gotten Lonzo Ball for Anthony Davis this season, people are going to look at them less than favorably.
Well, I want to comment two things about that, and then we should turn to Babylon 5, because otherwise this is going to be the first 2-hour podcast on the Boxscore Geeks Network. So the first thing is this. Do you remember who was the centerpiece of the trade that eventually went through for Chris Paul?
Drew Holiday, right?
No.
Eric Gordon.
Eric Gordon.
Yep, Eric Gordon.
Eric Gordon was the main piece that was traded for Chris Paul. And David Stern blocked that Chris Paul trade because he felt that it was better for the Pelicans to get Eric Gordon than to get Pau Gasol.
And if they wise too, they could have gotten Pau Gasol, and for whatever reason they let the Rockets in, they could have gotten Pau Gasol and Lamar Odom and some picks. And that's actually, like I said, on paper that made them a stronger team.
That was an incredible package. Admittedly, those players were getting older, but they were both, well, Pau Gasol was still going to be productive for quite some time, and if it hadn't been for the emotional fallout, Lamar Odom was still a very high-level player at that time. Of course, as we know, sadly his life fell apart after that.
Yeah, and I mean that's and so you said he had 2 points. So that was the first one. That was Eric Gordon was the centerpiece. Second point.
The second point is a lot of people in Lakerland wonder, hey, what's Lonzo going to be? Is he ever going to be a star? And of course, here in Boxscore Geeksland, we know that Lonzo, at a very young age, is already an above-average player. And a lot of times people compare him to Jason Kidd. And what I would have you do is to take a look at Jason Kidd's career and notice in his first season, Jason Kidd had a wins produced per 48 of 156. And in his second season, he had a wins produced per 48 of 135.
Whoa.
Lonzo Ball, first season, 153. His sophomore season this year, 141.
It's I mean,
it's eerie how closely they track.
And all Lonzo needs to do is slightly improve his shot, which we've been saying. And I mean, I think friend of the show, Art Rondeau, we've talked to a lot. He notes some of the big things for hampering player shooting is basically balance, and that a lot of that boils down to health. So it's like, I've got to believe that Lonzo Ball, his ankles not being healthy, if you know, the pinnacle of this player, right? You're a fan of him, Brian. Steph Curry. As soon as Steph Curry got healthy, it was game over.
Yeah. And by the way, another fun fact, Jason Kidd's true shooting percentage for his first 2 seasons, 47%. Lonzo Ball's true shooting percentage for his first 2 seasons, 46%.
The only unfortunate change is Jason Kidd existed in an era where that was less of a detriment. But that being said, yeah, we still think Lonzo Ball, the real problem we're going to give him, especially on the team he's on, is he's just not on the court enough. And I mean, if he can get up to 2,000, 2,500 minutes next season, that on its own is worth 3 or 4 wins. And I sincerely hope, I've started to see some people rumble about it. I really hope Anthony Davis ends up on the Lakers. It's so much better than anything else. And yeah.
Yeah, and I just hope that, it's funny, as a Lakers fan, we turn into Kremlinologists. And so today the news I was following was that Lonzo Ball had selected CAA as his representation. And I was thinking, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Because I think from the perspective of ensuring his long-term position on the Lakers, he probably should have chosen Clutch Sports and had LeBron as his agent.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because I also don't know if Lonzo Ball gets turned to something else if it's bad for the Lakers. I forgot to do my pizza metaphor, I realized, which is watching the Lakers and Nuggets complain is a lot like having it's good old days, but it reminds me of having a roommate that always orders pizza. And by that, what I mean is you might have a roommate who always orders pizza and you're like, I'm so effing sick of pizza. But the alternative being having a roommate that doesn't have any food at all, and you go like, is there any food in the house? And they go, there's some expired ketchup in the back, which is impressive because Brian noted pre-show ketchup takes a long time to expire. The Nuggets complaining about, we're destined to lose in the playoffs, and the Lakers complaining about the state of being. I agree, it's worth complaining about, but it's a lot like the pizza problem, meaning it is something that's annoying, but it's still much preferred to the alternative. So I just want to, for Lakers fans, for Nuggets fans, it is a much better place to be in to say you missed the playoffs because of injury and you look good going forward. For the Nuggets, you're probably going to the second round. I would much prefer those two things to the alternative, which is missing the playoffs for years on it.
By the way, one other little final note. So CAA is the same agency that has, as one of its members, Aaron Mintz. Aaron Mintz was the agent for D'Angelo Russell, for Julius Randle, and for Paul George. And one of the things that is an open secret in Lakerland is that the Lakers and Aaron Mintz hate each other now.
Oh, weird. Well,
so Paul George wanted to go to the Lakers, but Mintz wanted to make sure he didn't go.
That's interesting. I mean, I don't think that being on OKC was the worst, but man, if he'd played like he's playing and he'd gone to the Lakers, that could have been special this year. So
absolutely,
he might be kicking himself, to be honest, because in OKC, there's only so far that team's going to go. I'm gonna let you say whatever you want to say, because on last week's show I just made a shout out to Babylon 5, which is one of my favorite sci-fi shows, and just noted that despite all of the greatness that J. Michael Straczynski has as a showrunner, Babylon 5 being a show that ran for 5 seasons, had a bunch of failed spin-off and movie attempts, and now, because of politics in television land, is basically buried forever. So for better or for worse, what we have of Babylon 5 is what we have. But I just noticed that for whatever reason, despite all other good parts of J. Michael Straczynski, he just could not cast a captain worth a damn, and that was the big differentiator between it and Star Trek. Star Trek had lots of leads that were capable of leading the show, whereas Babylon 5 only had one guy that was really good at leading a show. And then unfortunately, the way Babylon 5 worked, J. Michael Straczynski said, I've got a 5-year arc I'm planning. And then the character in that 5-year arc had a 20-year lifespan. So he essentially pigeonholed himself because the one leading man he had, he basically gave a lifespan to. Whereas we've seen, you can have a lead character on a show just go on well past their prime, well past the show's stale date. Look at like Friends as an example. That can work, but JMS kind of wrote himself into a corner in that regard. And so I don't know if you were a Babylon 5 fan or had any Star Trek Babylon 5 points on that.
Yeah, so I would say that one of the things about Babylon 5, of course, a very well-known science fiction franchise, even if it has not had the same cultural impact as Star Trek, you could argue it was more groundbreaking. And Babylon 5 paved the way for the television we have today by being one of the first television shows to go to a serialized format, where there was continuity from episode to episode with a broader story arc. The idea of there being a broader story arc that somebody had planned out in advance, which is true for shows today like Game of Thrones, goes back to Babylon 5 and J. Michael Straczynski. So hugely influential in that regard. The other thing that's very interesting, and I only figured this out today, I was looking up the story. So you may remember that John Sheridan, played by Bruce Boxleitner, only comes to Babylon 5 in season 2. Do you remember the captain in season 1?
I know this whole story, so I want to hear you explain it, though. So it's Michael O'Hare was the captain in season 1, and what you're about to describe is so pivotal to why Babylon 5 was successful. And basically, if you're going the same route I am, hugely accidental and in some ways tragic.
Yes, exactly. So Michael O'Hare was a very well-respected actor. He had gone to Harvard. He had trained at Juilliard, and he had been picked by J. Michael Straczynski for Babylon 5. And unfortunately, during season 1, Michael O'Hare began to develop serious mental health issues. So he was having hallucinations and things that were making it difficult for him to work. And my understanding is that J. Michael Straczynski offered to put the show on hiatus so that he could get treatment and get better. But O'Hare said, no, I don't know if I'm going to get better, and I don't want to risk other people's jobs. And so he was written out of the show so that he could seek treatment. And Straczynski swore that he would never reveal the reason why. And O'Hare said, no, we're going to keep this secret to my grave, but you need to tell the story after I'm gone, because we need to protect my career. But after I'm gone, I want to make sure that people understand that this is a serious issue. And so Straczynski has told the story since then. But that is, as you put it, a very accidental and tragic reason for bringing Bruce Boxleitner, and whom I agree did a fantastic job as Captain John Sheridan.
Yeah, it was. We can give credit. So first off, one thing that was also impressive about J. Michael Straczynski, and he's talked about this, is if you're going to do a 5-year arc, you've got to accept what we're saying, like this, that the injuries happen. And the one advantage you have as a showrunner, as opposed to a basketball franchise, is there's no rule that says if LeBron James gets injured in a showrunner that you can't just buy a new LeBron James. Obviously, the NBA, CBA rules, you have to get some exemption. You have to waive LeBron. He can't come back. So JMS wrote what he called trapdoors into the show. So it didn't matter how big of a character. He lost two lead characters on that show in the course of the first 3 seasons, and was ready to write them off. Now, I think obviously enough characters go and it's a completely different show and whatever, but he had that in his back pocket. But then that's what makes the success of Babylon 5 like interesting and tragic, which is Bruce Boxleitner was not supposed to be there.
Yeah.
But that and it's very I'll bring it back to the Lakers. It's very Paul Westhead. Paul Westhead too, who came between.
So Paul Westhead. So what happened was Paul Westhead came in as a replacement for Jack McKinney, who suffered a serious bicycle accident, and McKinney's accident left him unable to coach, which is how Westhead came in. Westhead was then fired because he clashed with Magic Johnson, and the Lakers intended to make Jerry West the interim head coach. Jerry West refused, and as a result, Pat Riley became head coach. And of course, Pat Riley became one of the greatest coaches in the history of the NBA.
I'm sorry to get us off on a tangent, but I got to ask on Jerry West, because I know Kelly Scaletta on Twitter was talking about this. Jerry West, if you compare front office career plus player career, is probably untouchable.
There's a reason he's the logo. He literally is the logo of the league.
But I'm just saying that what's funny is, I mean, even Larry Bird, who I like, I think he gets more credit in some cases than he deserves for the Pacers' success back in the day and his coaching and all that. But I'll leave you alone, Larry Bird. But Jerry West just had an amazing post career. I'm amazed that he didn't want to go into coaching. Do you know why that didn't happen?
So the bottom line is that Jerry West was pathologically competitive, absolutely pathologically competitive. And it made him sick when he coached, because he had to deal with every game to game, and he couldn't get out there and play. And he was relying on his players. And it just caused him ulcers. It caused him all these problems. He hated coaching.
Was he the GM of the Lakers at the time, or did he have some role at the team?
Yes. So, no, he was just the coach. After being a player, he was just the coach, and he said, no, never again. And he then became the general manager, and of course is a legendary Hall of Fame general manager who would have made the NBA Hall of Fame just for being his for his general manager role.
Absolutely. I didn't know that about, because I was curious about that, because I was going to look that up just for fun this week. It was like a side project, because I was going, he is an amazing player. He is an amazing general manager. I was really, and then even just like an executive consultant, all that, I was really curious if he had a coaching career. And that explains a lot, and actually reminds me a lot of Billy Beane, because Billy Beane was very, very similar as a general manager versus player. It's like, if he was too close to the game, he was ineffective. So doing it at the high level made more sense.
Exactly. Very similar to the Billy Beane. Again, if somebody is pathologically competitive, coaching is really difficult, because you know what needs to be done, and yet you can't just do it yourself.
Absolutely. Okay, that was a tough. We got the Babylon 5 stuff. Do you have anything else? I'm glad you let me satiate that. What I'll say is we had some blitzscaling on the show, and we've gone a little over an hour, and I actually think we've kept this pretty tight. But so I do at least want to make sure we get the praise and maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll leave for. I'm sure there will be future shows or your shows, because I'm feeling, Chris. Maybe I'm wrong. Your show feels primed to take off. Chris Yeh Podcast, the Chris Yeh Podcast on Anchor FM. It's been going good. I'm really enjoying it. So what I was going to say is, you co-wrote the book Blitzscaling with Reid Hoffman. We've talked it before. I was amazed that it became something I started using in my MBA lingo, because when I first saw the premise for it and even first started listening to it, I went, this makes a lot of sense for business. The winner take all, build a company really, build a company really fast, accept kind of some of the pitfalls because getting to market and getting a market share trumps having a perfect product to go out there. And I said, that doesn't really fit with our kind of nerd-minded, get a perfect team, hire the right players, right? You only have 5 years as a championship window, arguably in an NBA team with a core. So getting that core as right as possible. But the key to it was like the winner take all. The winner take all mentality was really the light bulb that switched for me. So you wrote this book, Blitzscaling with Reid Hoffman. And it's with how much praise we give you for Mental Samurai. You've been everywhere. You said you've got a keynote speech you got to get to. What I've just got to ask, like, what's that been like, and what's the reception to Blitzscaling been?
So it has been fantastic. One of the things that we hoped for, but we didn't know would necessarily happen, but has happened, is that the term itself has become part of the lexicon. And I can track this because I have Google alerts set up for things like my own name and my book's names and things like that. And increasingly, various news articles refer to blitzscaling without even referring to the book. They just talk about it as a technique that people use. Now, oftentimes they're probably misinterpreting it, but that's okay. The first thing you need is for people to know your name. And then after that, you can worry about them getting the facts right. So that's probably been the most promising and rewarding thing, the fact that entrepreneurs and people out there are using it. And I'll give you a couple of examples. There is a company I was looking at with some friends of mine at potentially doing an investment, and the CEO said, "Oh, I have to tell you what happened." And she pulls out her phone and started showing them that over Christmas, a member of her team began reading the book and began snapping pictures of the pages and sending them via text message to this CEO saying, "Oh my God, this is exactly what we're going through. Oh my God, you got to see this." And then she bought copies of the book for herself and the entire team, and they all read the book, and they're all converts to the religion, so to speak. And this happens on a regular basis. Entrepreneurs come up to you and say, "Oh my gosh, wait a minute, are you the guy who wrote Blitzscaling?" And so that's been really gratifying as well. So all in all, reception has been great. Of course, there's still a lot more work to be done. There's still more extensions to blitzscaling. We need to explain better how blitzscaling works in different regions, in different industries and all that. But the core idea has really gotten a great reception.
I've got to ask an obnoxious follow-up question that I'm sure is just like the typical fan one. Alliance was great. Blitzscaling great. You planning another one? You're planning another set of napped all-nighters? Because I mean, your track record for books has been going amazingly well.
So we are thinking about doing various follow-ups to Blitzscaling, and I can't talk too much about them because nothing is finalized yet. I will say that we may very well be doing more podcasting and video work in addition to book work, simply because it feels like podcasting is having a great moment right now. There's more impact that you can have from audio and video than from purely just doing books. If you want to do a book, you should do a book, but also have these other media extensions simultaneously rather than after the fact. So that's a little preview of what we're working on.
Awesome. And then I've got to throw Brian under the bus. It's what I do on the show. So I just noted, like, as an aside on the show script when we were putting this together, I was like, I just got to at least make sure I comment that to you, right? That, I know you've heard the podcast where we talk about it. I at least got to say to Chris that I'm amazed how this applied and how, I think of like Anthony Davis, in Blitzscaling, one thing that you go for that I know the Freakonomics were one of the first people I heard that kind of did this is you try to fail. And in some cases, one thing, I don't know if the correct term, I know you have to have called it something in the book, which I did go through. So I apologize that I'm not remembering it correctly. But, the not being happy with your first product. Like, you should be embarrassed by the product you released, because if you're happy with the product, you spent too much time on the product. And that idea of like being willing to fail, trying to fail, feeling it out there, that was, I was reading that part of the book while I was watching the Anthony Davis thing. And I think that did color my perception correctly as opposed to a lot of other people, because I went, okay, they could sit on their hands and wait till the off season and they give up this season. If they get Anthony Davis in before the trade deadline, they're a playoff team. And God help me, I don't want to be the team facing LeBron James and Anthony Davis in the playoffs, even if they're the 8th seed. Even if you gave me all 7 games at home, I don't want to face Anthony Davis and LeBron James in the playoffs. So that was my thing, which I know made it a little different for me when I was watching other people. So whatever that term was, being willing to fail, I hope that becomes more part of it too, because I think a lot of people in business are not as comfortable with that. And I hope that they take that away from this book.
And by the way, it goes even further than that. And one of the reasons why the Lakers tried to acquire Anthony Davis during the season is because right now Anthony Davis only counts $20 million against the salary cap. And so I believe that what the Lakers were trying to do was to acquire Anthony Davis so they would still be able to bring in another max player in the offseason.
Which would be huge. And so, sorry, what I was going to say is I wanted to give you a huge compliment on the book, and that was going through my head and all that. And of course, the first thing Brian does when he looks on the scripts is he starts looking up articles with criticism. So I wanted to let Brian get one or two criticisms into the book, let you respond, and that can be our show. And in fact, it's possible my MacBook battery will die, but if that happens, you two just keep going, and then Brian, you'll have to take us out.
Okay, so in fairness to me, I was just randomly reading a few weeks ago and came across this, so I didn't dig it up just to ding you, Chris. I actually say, oh, someone wrote about you independently. But so this was an Axios article from a few weeks ago, and I'll just read a few brief things on it and let you reply. But because it was an interesting criticism to me. It was actually a very interesting criticism. So this was February 22nd, Felix Salmon. And the title is Meet the Startups That Have Raised More Than $1 billion. And we were talking about this a little before the show. They've coined a term even called Minotaur, which is separate from unicorn. The unicorn startups are the companies that are valued at $1 billion or more. And so they're kind of being cute and saying, well, it looks like we might have lost Dre, by the way, but we can keep going here.
We'll keep going.
We'll keep going. So they're trying to be cute and use a different mythological creature and say, well, you just raised $1 billion. We'll call that a Minotaur. And then there's one more sentence here that, again, the most interesting to me is that blitzscaling isn't designed to be healthy for the economy. It's a deliberate attempt to build a monopoly that can't be compete against unless you have the pockets that are $1 billion deep. And I think that's an interesting criticism because most people outside of the tech industry, that probably is their biggest concern today, right? I'm especially thinking of Google and Amazon. Those are companies that are coming under scrutiny for monopolistic practices. So anyway, what do you think about that article?
So it's very important to go into the nuances here, which is less popular, but we'll do it anyways. The first thing is to note that Blitzscaling is a book that we don't say go out and raise $1 billion and spend it as quickly as possible. What we say is you should be willing to sacrifice efficiency for the sake of speed. Simply raising a lot of money doesn't make you faster. It's how you spend the money that makes you faster. And that's one of those misnomers. People then say, well, Google only raised 36 million before its IPO. Well, Google was able to blitzscale because it had a massive advantage in its revenue stream and was therefore able to be enormously wasteful and do things like build up Waymo and all these other incredible products that have given Google a great strategic position. So the first thing is blitzscaling isn't about raising a huge amount of money. It's one of the ways that you can blitzscale, but it is not the only way you can blitzscale. The second is the word monopoly is a very loaded term that people love to throw around. And basically, when I think of a monopoly, I think of someone like John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil and being able to control all the rates that railroads charged and basically being able to crush your enemies like an oil baron. If you ever saw that recent Saturday Night Live sketch with Adam Driver as an oil baron, that was fantastic. So that's how I think of a monopoly. And a monopoly is designed to make it impossible for you to compete in the future. And people have this notion that today's tech companies are monopolies. And what we say is these are winner-take-most or winner-take-all markets for a reason. They're Peter Thiel used the term natural monopoly. I would prefer to say that they're markets that tend to build enduring market leaders. And they build enduring market leaders for a reason, because there are long-term competitive advantages to being the first person to scale. Now, there is a major school of thought right now, and this is the debate. One school of thought that goes by the neo-Brandeisian label, which is to say that they are followers of Louis Brandeis, a famed lawyer and Supreme Court justice from the early 20th century, that basically says if a company gets to a certain size, it is inherently a monopoly and should be broken up. And that's the neo-Brandeisian point of view. And that is one of the things that has really come back. There are all these scholars like Tim Wu who have been talking about we should bring back the neo-Brandeisian criteria. If a company is big enough, break it up.
Tim Wu is at Stanford, is that right?
So I think he's at, I believe he's at Yale or Columbia, but he has been a visiting scholar at Stanford.
Oh, you're right, Columbia. Okay.
Now, in addition to the neo-Brandeisian point of view, the school of thought that had won out for a long time is the Borkian point of view, named after Robert Bork, the legal scholar who was famously nominated for the Supreme Court but rejected by the Senate. And the Borkian point of view is that monopolies need to the reason we fight monopolies is if they harm the consumer. If the monopoly does not harm the consumer, then there's no basis for antitrust. So those are the two extreme points of view. And our point of view is that the whole point is we don't want companies to be able to block innovation, right? We should not be in a position where companies are allowed to block innovation. And if you look at the AT&T monopoly on telecommunications was remarkably uninnovative for a long time. The airlines were remarkably uninnovative for a long time because they were essentially monopolies or regulated industries where people did not compete. As long as there is competition, as long as there is the ability for other people to come in and for free choice of consumers, then I don't believe it's truly a monopoly. And people think about things like Facebook and say Facebook is a monopoly. Is that really true? If Facebook had not been able to cleverly buy Instagram and WhatsApp, we would right now be talking about how Facebook is fading because it is a desktop platform.
Getting its ass kicked by Instagram, right?
And it's getting its ass kicked by Instagram. Now, should they have blocked the acquisition of Instagram? That would have been difficult. Instagram had only 100 million users at the time, and it had zero revenues at the time. And so what antitrust person in the world would have said, I can look into the future and see this is the thing that's going to allow Facebook to continue to be so powerful. So I think it's very dangerous to say we're just going to break up companies if they're big. Yeah. And the other argument for why this is especially dangerous is because we live in a multipolar world now. And if we, the United States, are breaking up our companies, then we are putting them at a competitive disadvantage in comparison to Chinese companies, Russian companies, companies in other geographies around the world where their governments may not be quite so keen on the neo-Brandeisian point of view. I would argue that in the field of artificial intelligence, in many ways, the United States is already behind China. And that the fact that we have companies like Google that have made heavy investments in artificial intelligence is probably good from a national security standpoint.
Wow. I was going to say.
That was a great answer. Can I ask one quick follow-up, Trey? I love that answer, though.
Go for it.
So there's the really specific criticism from Warren is what I'm hearing, and what she says is not the size of the company, but a company like Amazon controls the platform and the product both, and she wants to split that up, and she's been saying that a lot lately. And the idea is here basically if Amazon controls all the categories and all the discovery, and they're have all these great ways to look at the analytics there, and they see, oh, here's some new product that's really kicking ass and is the best product in all of Amazon. We can put our own Amazon branded product in to compete with it, and so they use the platform in an anti-competitive way. So I mean, this is a little different from what you're talking about, but I don't know if you have any reactions to that.
So there was actually a very thoughtful take on this that I believe Ben Thompson at Stratechery wrote up. And I'll refer you to that for greater detail. I'll just give you my take, but I think he went through it in great detail and responded to it. The first thing I'll note is it's important to remember that Elizabeth Warren is a legal scholar, not an economic scholar.
That's right.
And so, a lot of times we have people who are politicians saying, oh, I understand economics, and that's why we should have rent control. I'm like, no, you haven't actually talked to
She was
economists.
A law professor, right, at Harvard or something.
She is a very smart person, but she is not a qualified economist. She may know antitrust law, but she is not a qualified economist, and it's important to keep that in mind. So when it comes to Amazon and the question of platform versus application on the platform, this boils down to what extent are you actually blocking people out versus what extent are you in fact just competing on a relatively fair playing field? This actually happened back in the dot-com boom. If you may recall, one of the things that people said is, oh no, Microsoft is going to own the internet because everyone is using Windows, and therefore everyone will use MSN. And this notion was MSN was going to dominate, it was going to kill AOL and the internet, and there was going to be no internet, there was just going to be MSN. How did that turn out?
Yeah. And so I think where you're getting at is Amazon is winning because it's the best product, right? Not because they're, using their power. Anyway, okay, sorry, Dre, my questions are done.
Well, I'll give some fairness to Brian. So Brian did admit on the show a few weeks ago he didn't listen. So I was chuckling because I was like, Brian's cheating Chris into basically giving a free audiobook sample because I was basically hearing some stuff that I heard on the.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's not a problem. I'll give one last my piece of feedback. There was an economics book I read way back in the day that made the point. Sorry, I'm going to mess this up. I want to get this right. The market, as in the free market, is not immoral; it's amoral.
Yeah. And
the book went out of its way to say, as policy, it is actually important for governments to account for things like this new technology may put a lot of people out of work, and it is our job as a government to handle that displacement, as opposed to saying the market's going to solve everything, because the answer is the market doesn't care about these people. Yeah. But the key they wanted to make is the market isn't doing it out of malice, the market's doing it out of apathy, and it's up for us as humans to do it as of that. I would argue with blitzscaling, you said here is a technique in ways we've noticed this technique being used, and also you could put it, or better or for worse, this is out of the bag. This is how things are happening. So if you're going to do this, this is what we've noticed. Here's our advice on it. Here's things that have, success and fail. Even listing companies that might be considered a success, you go through pitfalls and things that they've done wrong, and said even that. And you do go out of your way in the book to do a very good job about talking about how important a good culture and how we shouldn't let problems with like the rampant sexism and racism that tech has had. And I would argue, maybe I'm wrong, Chris, you wrote the book, so you know better, your take as the author than me. I would argue that in that section of the book, you're like, here is a place that we have clearly failed. This methodology is good. Here was a big blind spot a lot of places that successfully didn't have. And if you are going to blitzscale, you have to think about having basically the impact of gender and diversity at your company and have it from day one. Because by the time you've blitzscaled to a $1 billion unicorn or what was the term, Brian?
Minotaur.
By the time you've got there, it's kind of too late. So I would argue in your book you said that. So I think that would be to try and kind of do the defense, saying you were basically saying here is a technique, here's what we've noticed. And I would argue one thing I loved about your book, Chris, that I haven't seen as many books that argue business and economics do, is you basically went out of your way to say, here are some of the ethical ramifications you should consider in your company. And I would say I would like more people than to go for these kind of strategies, the blitzscaling one, from an analytical perspective, because I feel a lot of people stay out of them for emotional reasons. They say, I can't do that risk, it's too risky. And I wish a lot of people would actually try them, because then we would get a more diverse set of people doing blitzscaling, and that might help Silicon Valley. That'd be my take.
And a very nuanced argument, which I'm going to make because we have a very intelligent listenership for the Boxscore Geeks podcast, is that before we codified the rules of blitzscaling and explained how it worked, the mechanisms of action, and explained how you could be responsible while blitzscaling as a technique, without that name, because we made up that name, was something that was typically only practiced by the most aggressive entrepreneurs. And they just practiced it because they were innately aggressive. And some of those innately aggressive entrepreneurs were good people and built companies with good cultures. But it was very common that those entrepreneurs who are highly aggressive also have other undesirable personality traits. And that one of the things we hope with blitzscaling is by demystifying this and explaining to people how someone who wants to be a responsible person can apply this technique, that more people will be able to apply this technique, and not just the people with that innate aggression.
I love it. I'm on board. Yeah, so we've hit our classic about an hour and a half on the show. I'm actually excited because I didn't hear all of it. I was fixing my power cord while some of it goes on, so that means I get a little bonus content when I go back and listen. I'm just going to take us to shout-outs, so just to make sure, though, that you know where to find Chris Yeh on Twitter. Great name there. the Chris Yeh Podcast. You can find it just by searching for it. You can find it, but specifically Anchor FM. I try and do it. I don't know if you've been doing much blogging lately, but obviously I think that's because of the book writing. So there is Adventures in Capitalism, the blog. And then I think do you just have the Blitzscaling domain direct, right? I know you.
Yes, blitzscaling.com. You can find plenty of information there. And you can also go to globalscalingacademy.com for information on classes and other programs that we run to help people adopt the ideas of blitzscaling. And
then last point, on April 30th, everybody tune into Mental Samurai. Let's make our mark. Let's really confuse it. The ratings I was looking up look okay. It's on the bubble basically. Yeah. For renewal. So if a couple good names come out or something goes viral, I think it could do an uptick. Let's make April 30th that show. Tune in, and we'll see if we can figure out some kind of Twitch or live stream for that. I'll use that to take us into shout-outs. I actually do have a couple. I'm going to give my shout-out to WWE for Kofi Kingston and Becky Lynch, the man. I actually watched WrestleMania for the first time in years, and I have some comments about the matches themselves, but Kofi Kingston versus Daniel Bryan and Becky Lynch winning was great. Any shout outs out of you, Brian?
No, just shout out to you guys, especially Chris, for coming and doing the show. It was a lot of fun.
And I'm going to shout out the great Alex Caruso, who is playing at a star level for the Los Angeles Lakers. He looks like an insurance salesman. He's got an unfortunate hairline, a terrible mustache, but my goodness, he went down the lane, tried to dunk on Rudy Gobert, and I just love the guy.
Shooting 53% from three, guys. How about that?
See if you can keep it up. He's the kind of anti-Lonzo. All right. Well, anyway, that has been our show. If you find us not through the website, you can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. We go live every week, usually around 9:30 p.m., sometimes a little later. Mondays on twitch.tv/Nerd Numbers. You can catch recaps of the show, channel Nerd Numbers on YouTube. And, of course, we're on iTunes and Stitcher, the Boxscore Geek Show. I've been your host, Trey Alvarez. You can find me on Twitter as Nerd Numbers. Brian Foster on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Shouting out our special guest again, Chris Yeh on Twitter as Chris Yeh. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next week.